Well, in this lecture, we would be looking at some of the debates and controversy regarding shifting cultivation. I've been partly mentioning about shifting cultivation time and again, but we haven't really looked at the historical background and the kind of debate which involve among academics, uh, policy makers, and there are different kinds of perspective, maybe even within the disciplines of social sciences, for instance, like the economists or ecologists or maybe the sociologists or anthropologists. They have different viewpoint depending on their kind of research engagement. Therefore, it is important to look at uh, how shifting cultivation have been perceived across different point of time, and it would be good to look at uh, the historical background of how this controversy or debate in a way has arises. And one very important reason why we are looking at the theme of shifting cultivation is because mostly among the tribal communities, uh, it is partly the major or dominant part of their natural resource management. So, policymakers, or if not the ecologists and environmentalists, have been always questioning that is shifting cultivation uh, the best form of sustainable resource management. So, keeping in mind these particular questions, we will try to look and engage in delving upon the debates of shifting cultivation. Now, for instance, to begin with, if you look at the scenario of Northeast India, of course, this shifting cultivation is being practiced across India, and then even if you look at the global scenario, mostly in Latin America and South Asia and East Asia, like Philippines, Vietnam, so on and so forth, they have been practicing this for generations. Now, the reason I am highlighting the context of Northeast because I am familiar with it, and then each communities have different names given in the local context, but in general parlance, it is understood as jhuming. Now, if you look at the context of Northeast, uh, and mostly the topographical and the geographical areas, uh, it is mostly a valley which is being surrounded by the hills. So, the hill areas in a way make up most of the geographical landscape, and the question is to what extent the ecological or geographical landscape in a way pave way or is suitable for the practice of these forms of agriculture practices. Now, as we all know, Northeast in a way comprises of 8 states, and namely Arunachal Pradesh, Assam, Manipur, Meghalaya, Mizoram, Nagaland, Sikkim, and Tripura, and it which has a total crop of 5.3 million hectares and a population of around 39 million, and at least 70% or to 80% are still predominantly dependent on agriculture. And when we talk about agriculture, it is not purely based on jhuming or shifting cultivation per se, but also there are people who practices the terrace or wet rice cultivation. So, we will also try to engage in looking at the pros and cons of practicing shifting cultivation and the wet rice cultivation, and to what extent the kind of policy which is being espoused by the government is being effective or not. Now, again this region normally, I mean the 8 states is again dominated by the tribal population, and the development of agriculture and production of food grains in the region is highly depends upon the custom, culture and the food habit of the local people. So, therefore, shifting cultivation in this region is not necessarily confined or evolve around the idea of this economic practices, but also a lot of custom, culture and traditions are embedded, and in the process it has become not just an economic aspect, but a way of life for them. And the kind of challenges which is being witnessed in the past few decades is as a result of the decreasing availability of land areas. It could be because of the process of urbanization, the growth of population. So, the kind of space which is being required to practice these agriculture practices in a way is still pretty much in questions. Therefore, the challenges arise not just in terms of space, but also the question of this environmental sustainability is being raised. Now, I am not going to in this lecture, I am not going to delve into the in-depth analysis of how this shifting cultivation is being practiced or the kind of socio-cultural practices embedded in it, but for you to have a general idea of to what extent people are dependent and in which particular region the shifting cultivation is predominantly practiced, so that you are familiar with it, and then we move on to the the what shifting cultivation is and the kind of debates which revolve around these practices. Now, shifting cultivation is understood differently in different regions across the world. Now, mostly as I pointed out, in the northeast region, it is popularly known as jhuming, and whereas in the places like Philippines, Vietnam and Laos, Cambodia, it is known as Sweden agriculture or Swedening, and also it is known as slush and burn, and which perhaps has been practiced by these communities mostly for more than a millennia, and then even in many of the literature you would come across that these practices are being done since time immemorial. So, jhuming in a way in the context of northeast region is a complex system with wide variation that depends upon the kind of ecological variation in the area and cultural diversity among various tribal communities. The reason being that each and every communities have not just followed the agriculture calendar, but so is the socio-cultural practices which revolve around this agriculture calendar. And also maybe depending on their topographical landscape, they have no other option but to practice this. Now, without much ado, we will try to look at the concepts and meanings and methods which involve in shifting cultivation. Now, how is shifting cultivation being practically being done in the land? Shifting cultivation in a way is a system in which maybe a patch of forest or land is being cleared, and once those dry branches and leaves are usually being burned before the onset of the rainy season, that is the monsoon season, so that the site is being opened and for the release of the nutrients. Now, the use of this fire, that is the burning of those twigs and leaves, in a way enhance the soiled nutrients, and also it tends to destroy the other unwanted wets. At the same time, also different kinds of insects which are perhaps considered to be a threat to those crops. Now, one of the reasons why the primary thing which method which involved in this shifting cultivation is burning. So, therefore, many people normally use the term called slush and burn, that is filling the vegetation and also engage in burning. Now, different communities have different knowledge of this use of fire, and from an outsider's point of view, usually the use of this fire is considered to be a threat, and which eventually lead to extensive deforestation. But for those who practice, it enhances the the soiled nutrients as a process of that. Now, these clear fields, or once the vegetations are in a way being burned, it is with the onset of this monsoon, it allows to engage in deepling or sowing of seeds, and once the monsoon comes, it sort of germinates the seeds, and after the harvesting season, these areas often is left behind, and which is left to lie fallow for a varying period, that is normally maybe 10 to 20 years, and then depending on the availability of land, it is being left so that a secondary forest is being allowed to regrow. Now, one very important thing which is being witnessed in the recent trends is with the change of the seasonal changes, like the expectation of monsoon, so and so forth. As we all know, to some extent, because of the climatic changes, the adequate rainfall which is usually expected is normally not coping up to the kind of agriculture calendar which was normally followed. So, therefore, it poses some kind of a threat to those who practices this agriculture system. Now, they in a way have tries to as we have discussed in the human ecology and so on and so forth, that perhaps human is the best to adapt or come up with a different kind of mechanism in any type of environment. Now, therefore, they have in a way switched to different forms of timing, at the same time farming practices. Now, one of the reasons why these practices is being, for those who are in favor of these practices, normally says that these practices in a way allows this agroforestry, wherein a mixed cropping is being done. At the same time, it doesn't really hamper the forest or trees. Now, in this agriculture is manage the system in a ways that not only integrate production from the cultivated fields and also the diverse secondary forests, which also include everything from grass and bushes in its early stages, and also to the young open canopy trees to mature close canopy tree communities. So, in a way, it gives a space to let the other tree grows. So, therefore, this kind of practices to many of the ecologists and environmentalists appears to be some sort of a kind of agroforestry, as it allows and gives space in accommodating the trees to grow. Now, each and every successive states, like maybe right from the clearing or slashing down of those vegetations, and then the process of this burning of those dry twigs and leaves is followed by sowing of the seeds, and also the period of this removing the weeds or weeding, and then the harvesting. So, this sort of period or cycle in a way is something which is pretty much visible in the context of these shifting cultivations. And now, what are the kind of cropping system which is normally followed? It usually follows this practices this mixed cropping, and then maybe different kinds of cereals, pulses, oil seeds and vegetables to in a way suffice the needs of the family. And if you look at mostly in the markets, maybe in the cities and so on and so forth, many of the vegetables which in a way is available is mostly from those kinds of farming practices. Now, one of the beauty or the something which is evident from this mixed cropping system is the kind of strategy or tactics behind this cropping system is when you plant different kinds of crops. So, chances are there that some crops might fail, but whereas other might grow and then prosper. So, therefore, in this mixed cropping system, even if as a result of the climatic changes and the short supply of this monsoon rainfall, there are still possibilities that it has the scope and chances of being to go ahead with this kind of cultivation. So, the crops normally which are grown here are simultaneously and harvested sequentially, and the slush and burn technique is normally adopted to cultivate the sweetened lands. And the beauty of this particular cultivation is no external nutrients are being used for cultivating the crops. So, which relies on the available soil nutrients of that ecological space. So, therefore, what we call as organic farming or organic food, which is pretty much in demand in this present time, is mostly a product of this sort of type of cultivation. Now, one of the major requirements for any community to be dependent on this jhuming is access to enough forested lands at their disposal. To that, Sweden follow the pattern to be established. Now, as I was saying, one of the main threats and challenges being encountered is how to get access to these forested lands. Now, different kinds of forest policies are being enacted time and again, and many of these policies are in a way restricting the use or access to this forested land to many of those indigenous communities who are pretty much dependent on this kind of cultivations for millennia. Now, the question arises, if they are being restricted in using or having access to this forested land, what are the available or possible alternative which the government in a way has formulated. So, these are some very pertinent questions which allow us to look into the kind of the politics, if not the political ecology of these agriculture practices. Now, if you look at the kind of labor which involve in this kind of cultivation, it compare with the maybe the terrace or any kind of monocropping or any case crop plantation. This sort of cultivations perhaps seems to be much more labor intensive, and usually from an economic perspective it tends to is considered to be sort of unproductive and unremunerative, possibly when you are calculating the amount of labor which is being employed and then the kind of production. So, therefore, the input and output is usually being measured, and many have come to the conclusion that it is labor intensive and the return is low. So, therefore, it apparently it is uneconomical and then not really supported by this idea of the utilitarian, if not you can say the commodification of resources. Now, even then this jhuming or shifting cultivation happens to occupy a distinct place in the tribal economy and constitute a vital part of the lifestyle and socio-economic setup of hilled and tribal regions, and mostly as I was talking about the northeast region. Now, every state has their own policies of controlling, and then how this idea of stopping these practices are being initiated by the forest department in every state, but so far it appears that it seems to be unsuccessful in this. And this form of cultivation is regarded as a distinct stage in the evolution of agriculture. In fact, its origin is traced as far back as to the Neolithic period between the years 1300 to 3000 BC. So, beginning from the Neolithic period, this sort of cultivation has its origin. Now, why is it that which has this existence for millennia in a way being increasingly posing a threat, or the sudden realizations of these practices being seen to be a threat to the environment and uneconomical. Now, for that to have this answer, we will come to the later part of discussion. Now, despite its ancient roots and the kind of predominance among the hill and tribal regions, shifting cultivation has been subject to several criticism, primarily from the perspective of ecology or sustainability, because it is considered to be ecologically destructive with the kind of mess it created, or to the loss of this forested land. Now, as I said, it is not just confined to a single region, but across different parts of India. And if you look at the report of a UN study in 1971 to 75, it observed that there was slightly less than 3 million people primarily or partially dependent on these modes of cultivation, and an estimate area of which was practiced a year was less than 1 million hectares. Now, from an economic vantage point of, if you look at this, the cultivation which is sprawling an area of 1,000,000 hectares and which does not have much of a turnout, is seen to be a waste, and which is often seen to be an evil practices by many policymakers, and also beginning from the colonial period. Now, how is this the opposition or ideas of discontinuing this jhuming emerges, or the discourses within which this idea emerges is to be related back to the historical period, that is Warren Elwin, an eminent anthropologist and perhaps one of the best friend of the late Prime Minister Jawaharlal Nehru, and who have been engaged in framing different tribal policies, have been in a way instrumental in trying to look at the kind of engagement of how tribals are in a way to be rehabilitated, or if not what kind of processes needs to be inculcated in terms of bringing them in the mainstream. Of course, they do follow this idea of isolationist, but then one of the main problems or principles which guided as a result of this Elwin's initiative is that modern science in a way should be able to help the tribal economy, and without destroying their socio-cultural practices and of course the jhuming practices. Now, perhaps this was the first kind of steps which in a way contradicts to the kind of practices these people has followed. Now, the question remains, how could this modern science fit in with a local knowledge system that has been deeply entrenched in the artifact socio-cultural and tribal way of life? Now, in the previous lectures, I have been talking at length about what indigenous knowledge is, what traditional ecological knowledge is, and to what extent this knowledge system is part and parcel of the indigenous people's way of life. And we have also pointed out the differences between the scientific and the traditional knowledge, and what are the discourses, the way in which this knowledge system are being perceived. Now, for quite some time, the academics and policy makers who are concerned with environment and the issue of this development tried to combine arguments for improvement in the jhumias, that is those who practice jhuming, quality of life, with a concern for the quality of environment for sustainable growth. Now, this research aim at informing state policy and influencing the government action through development model. Now, the idea is how does one perceive these practices by the developmental model or the state led development, and based on this perception, or maybe let us say with the kind of stereotypes they have against the tribals, they tends to frame certain kinds of policy and try to impose rather than trying to unearth the kind of connectivity or the socio-cultural backgrounds of those who practices. Now, within this discourse, as I am sure you are familiar with already familiar with indigenous knowledge, traditional knowledge, and will it be feasible to replace these practices, or what would be the possible outcome or consequences if once wants to replace these kind of practices. These are some questions which should in a way be taken into account. Now, the policy to create an alternative land use and the agrarian system and subsequently to the rehabilitation of the jhumyas has developed an anti-jhum discourse. That is, jhuming is perceived to be something which is as I said, unremunerative practices, or something which is seen to be evil in the context of environment and development growth debate. Now, one needs to contextualize in that environment and development growth, because that is perhaps the starting point where jhuming has been widely criticizes from different practitioners like the agronomists, the economists, policy makers, and even the geographers. Now, I would say this misconception or criticisms arises as they are not really well versed with the affinity or the kind of attachment they share with these practices, because one tends to evaluate things from its the external or the facial perspective, rather than trying to unearth the intrinsic or the esoteric things which is pretty much embedded in it. Perhaps this is also because there is a little understanding of the complex system that jhum supports, that is the idea of the jhum calendar, that is the agricultural calendar, the practice of the collective work and collective ownership that is primarily based on community land, that maintains the egalitarian structure of society, and also, as we had discussed, the method which involves mixed cropping, that diversified food grain choice, and most importantly the self sufficiency, that is self sustenance. Now, this idea of the social structure in a way is also having a lot of impact on these practices. If you would recall the idea of social ecology, which was propounded by Murray Bookchin, talks about the environmental problems which needs to be located within the context of the social structure, the hierarchy which exists between or among different kinds of societies. So, it is this hierarchy which in a way has to be eliminated if the environmental problems has to be solved. So, therefore, they have these communities who practices jhum cultivation in a way has a collective ownership, that is the lands are being communally owned, and then it is being cared and nurtured by the collective. So, therefore, this idea of egalitarianism was pretty much prevalent in their social structure, at the same time the kind of economic structure. So, because they do not have this idea of surplus if not owning an individual property. Now, therefore, the idea of producing a surplus does not really arise. So, therefore, people are being much sufficient, and they tend to produce things which are adequate to them and which are self sufficient for their consumption or basic needs. Now, they are not being guided by this idea of capitalist mode of production or any market oriented production. Now, shifting cultivation has been primarily based on what Marx
considered as the ascetic mode of production, where there is the idea of the surplus and private property does not arise. Now, and the whole economy in a way is based on self subsistence or subsistence economy. Now, therefore, this ascetic mode of production, which is inherent in the shifting cultivation, is again antithetical to the market, if not the capitalist mode of production. Now, who are the ones propagating or trying to push this sort of profit oriented, if not capitalist mode of production? It is normally being pushed forward by the state. Now, we will also come to the historicity of how these shifting cultivators or jhumias, or what James Scott as termed as jhumias, are in a way a state evading people, because in this kind of practices, since the government in a way consider it to be a waste and there is no turnout, since there is no surplus, it is sort of a loss to the state, because it doesn't kind of produce any revenue, because the source of revenue is absent in this kind of practices. Now, what are the kind of colonial perception towards these practices? Because many of policies which are being enshrined, maybe it may be the forest policies, it may be the kind of conservation, preservation and so forth, is again something which is being borrowed from our colonial masters. And India has been, as we all know, for more than 200 years being colonized, and apparently this idea of colonial hangover is still very much embedded and then seen in the kind of how our policies are being framed. Now, if you look at the history, that as early as 1883, Baden-Powell, the British policy maker, has in a way strongly advocate the absolution of this jhum in this manner, and he made a remark that the fact is that this cultivation, that is jhuming, is so wasteful that somehow or the other it must be put to a stop, just like city or any great evil. Now, it is seen to be evil perhaps because of the output, because it does not have really anything to enhance the state revenue, and it is seen to be unproductive from the perspective of the civilizational point of view, that is the colonial perspective. Now, this observation had a wider impact on the colonial policy towards the treatment of the jhumias or the jhum land, and the perceptions of the state towards such agriculture economy was vindicated. Now, this perception, or I would say the stereotyping of these practices, in a way has guided the state-led policies since then. Now, similarly, in the Northeast region, the land revenue department could not make a great deal of revenue from the prevalence of jhum. Now, this was because the upland areas under colonial domination were subjected to a house tax rather than a land revenue assessment. Now, if you tends to look at the literature mostly among the tribal communities in the Northeast region, you will come across that many of them simply pay house tax and then they do not pay land revenue, because many of the upland areas are still not being surveyed by the state, and then it does not come under the clause of the land revenue department. Therefore, it in a way is considered to be a loss to the state if this kind of agriculture practices continue. So, this sort of idea has evolved and then being pretty much influenced by the colonial perception towards jhuming practices. Now, as I had said, if once try to look at the forest policies, I would still say that it is a continuation of the colonial legacy. Why? Because this official policy of the British Raj was in a way carried forward even after almost 70 years after independence by the Indian state, without taking into account the relevance of jhum in the hill economy of the tribal communities. Perhaps because they tends to overlook the kind of factors which played around or which is embedded in these agriculture practices, because as I said, it should not be seen from a narrow or isolated practices of in terms of the economy or agriculture rather, but one needs to take into account the kind of other factors which are also inherent in these practices, like the socio-cultural factors, the attachment with the land, and how it is being a question of survival and identity of the people concerning in that region. Now, the government after independence tends to come up with various 5 years plans, and also primarily embark on a policy to commercialize Indian agriculture that would weed out all forms of this self-subsistence farming, which also include the jhuming practices. Now, why is the state moving towards commercializing the resources rather? Is because by and by we tends to mimic and then ape the European or the colonialist mindset or policies in terms of raising the state GDP or so on and so forth. So, perhaps all these in a way influence the state policies. Now, the ecologists and demographers on the other hand have developed an anti-jhum discourse as a result of this, and on the presupposition that as a result of the short jhum cycle, it has led to a loss of this sustainable agriculture in the hills. Now, this idea or the debate of sustainability comes into question as a result of the recent trends of the loss of vegetations, forested land, so on and so forth. Now, therefore, one needs to look at the social and economic history of these who practices, because we can't afford to evaluate or comes to a conclusion by merely observing the present trends, and perhaps there could be other factors, not just primarily jhuming cultivation. Now, one tends to overlook the kind of the timber extraction or maybe any other kind of let us say mining and so on and so forth, and perhaps the blame always goes to those the marginalized or those indigenous communities. So, therefore, one needs to look at the political ecology of how one tend to perceive this shifting cultivation. Now, many of these ecologists or demographers or the state policy makers tend to blame the these communities who practice this jhuming by branding them or labeling them as a primitive practice, or making putting them in a very disadvantaged and vulnerable position to even survive. Now, sometime from a civilizational discourse which is being proposited by the British colonialists, and then at the same time carried forward by the state, as if these communities who practices jhuming needs sort of rehabilitation, and then because they need to be mainstream, and they should engage in a civilized agriculture practices, which in a way is something which has not just marginalized them, but also the question of survival or their identity is being a threat as a result of all these assumptions and then the perception from the state. Now, from the government or the state perspective, the issue of this shifting cultivation is also related to forestry and forest management. Now, forest policies in most of the developing or third world countries are in a way they closely followed those they had under the colonial rules, and India is not exception to this, as I pointed out. Now, therefore, one needs to reframe and restructure. Now, if you remember in the previous lectures when I was talking about how these ecological problems or the environmental problems are to be addressed and located, because one needs to also look at the kind of the human nature relationship which is prevalent in the developed countries and in the underdeveloped or third world countries. Now, mostly Ramchandra Guha in a way tends to divide this as the north and the south divide, because the protections or conservation of environment to the north and to the southern countries is different, because ecology to the south is a matter of their survival and subsistence, rather to the northern developed countries it is a question of protecting the environment for their own health, and also altogether there is a different perception which revolve around the psyche of the affluent communities. Now, in recent years this environmental cost has raised important questions on the government policy outcome. Now, along with this the demographers in a way maintains that the rise in population has caused a further misery and uncertainty to many indigenous natives living close to nature. So, even then they tend to overlook the kind of connections and attachments that these societies or communities share, that harmonious relationship with nature. They tends to perceive from the the productive, if not the output usually from these practices. So, therefore, one needs to question the kind of perceptions with the state, or the state follows what kind of ideas this perhaps needs to be in a way deconstruct. Now, if you look at the work of these Madhav Gadgil and Ramchandra Guha, they elaborate that the shortage of land for the Sweden agriculture, or maybe a prey for hunters and grazing for pastoralists as a result of degradation in forest. Now, control over these scarce resources also in a way generate certain kinds of conflicts among different groups and communities, or maybe people like inhabiting different kinds of geographical space. For example, most of Northeast India and the Chittagong hill tracts in Bangladesh are in a way militarized. Now, a detailed account of the situations in this area shows that it is not just a question of maintaining law and order, but also of land and forests, which remain central to the economy of the region and identity of its population. Now, if you browse through the net, I have written a piece of paper on how the indigenous community perceive the idea of development through dam, and I give a title called "The Enclosures of Colonization, Indigeneity and Development." Now, in that I argue that many of the state, mostly because my study is confined in Manipur, so I give a critical look at how the state-led development agendas by building a dam is being pushed forward. Now, if you look at the geographical space of Manipur, 90% of the state is hill areas which are dominated by the tribal communities, and 10% or less than 10% is the valley, which is mostly dominated by the non-tribals. So, in that, if you look at many of the dams, like maybe the Mapit Hill Dam, which I was conducting a field work, it appears that the state wants to push forward that kind of development practices, so that in the periphery those communities are being displaced, and those areas are being controlled by the state. And this sort of forceful intrusion or displacement is again being initiated under the image of this maintaining law and order, because as I said, the idea of this militarization, and I am sure you all are familiar with the APSPA, that is the Armed Forces Special Power Act, which is pretty much in the deployed in northeast region of India and then part of Kashmir. So, in order to maintain this law and order, and under this particular policy, the state in a way tends to misuse their power and then intrude or tries to colonize the indigenous people's land by pushing forward these state development agendas like building a dam. Now, therefore, one also needs to look at the politics behind of how the indigenous people's land are being put within the framework of the state. And therefore, one needs to look at the history, and then depending on the kind of region you talk about, maybe the Chittagong hill tracts and other areas, the history in a way has witnessed this kind of contestations and struggles between tribals and non-tribals over the control of land and forest. Now, again, let me add one particular point in the context of Manipur, that in 2004 they have come up with a new land use policy, which is in a way adopted from the state of Mizoram. Now, in this new land use policy, it has been pointed out that the jhuming practice or shifting cultivation is a wasteful practices. So, the state government should come up with a new land use policy by surveying or putting all those land under the revenue department, and they should monitor in such a way that the people who are the practicing shifting cultivation should be stopped, and an alternative ways of means of livelihood should be inculcated. Now, the problem arises here that in the state of Mizoram, like majority of them are tribal, so it's not much of a problem to them, but in the context of Manipur, like majority of them are non-tribals who are confined in the valley and the hill areas. So, since the land revenue and land records are not prevalent in the hill areas, so to push forward this new land use policy is something which also have a politics behind, again intruding or colonizing the indigenous people's habitat areas or forest land. Now, therefore, one needs to locate and tries to understand the politics behind how these policies are being pushed forward, and to what extent the state is being guided by this idea of a sincere rehabilitation alternatives to these communities. Now, again from the works of Guha and Gedgil, the forest policy of the government of India, which has continued with the colonial legacy, and how this has directly affected the Riang tribe in Tripura. I have given this in the reference. Maybe you can have further understanding of how the implication of shifting cultivation and the Tripura state policies is being witnessed or in the context of the Riang tribe, how the state is trying to put forward the alternatives or the feasibility of trying to push forward the forest policy of the government of India by restricting or limiting the access and use of the forest land. Now, the colonial rulers were in a way guided by this idea of generating revenue from the agricultural expansion, and this was the sole reason for economic exploitation of the forest area in the subcontinent. Again, if you look back at the history of the tea plantations or the coffee plantations, which is predominant in the valley of Assam, if you look at, these are some of the initiatives which are being taken by the colonialists, because they are in a way able to generate much more revenue to the state rather than these practices of or the wasteful practices of jhuming cultivation. Now, these are something which the environmental historian are also arguing about, that how these colonial rulers in a way have initiated the kind of agriculture practices, the kind of plantation or the kind of forest policies which they have initiated, where carried forward to satisfy their economic needs, or rather the generating of this revenue. Now, if one wants to look at the forest policy, for instance, the Indian Forest Act of 1848, it happens to be a major blow to many of the tribal communities who are dependent on the customary use of forest and its products. Now, if you single out jhuming cultivation, it is primarily an agriculture practices. Now, apart from that, accessibility or using of the free use of these forests is not just limited alone to agriculture, but also people are dependent on the non-timber forest products, like they engage in edible items of plants, roots, shrubs, so on and so forth. So, and again, many of these food items enhances to the the caste or the cash income of these people, because they rely on these food items being gathered from the forest and then being sold in the market, and then this enhances some sort of a security to the people. Now, if this kind of act is in a way fully implemented or being targeted to those people who are dependent on the customary use of forests and its products. It not just only affects their means of livelihood, but the means of survival are at stake. Now, the colonial rulers in a way implemented a system of these forestry management that conflicted with the traditional practices of the forest dwellers. For instance, the shifting cultivation, which was again intrinsic to the tribal way of living, and which was considered as primitive and unremunerative. Now, many of the policies in a way stem from this policymakers' point of view, which regarded these tribal communities as primitive, and certain groups were even termed as savages and apes because of different pigmentation food habits, which often included human flesh and others indicators of animality. Now, this sort of stereotyping and labeling a certain sections of community or group as uncivilized and primitive in a way is a ploy on the part of the policy makers to alter, if not rehabilitate them from these evil practices. So, these are some of the ideas which are pretty much embedded in the psyche of the policy makers, and perhaps these are all because of the lacking of knowledge and the well-being of those communities. So, nobody really questioned or tends to understand how sustainably these communities, that is those who practices jhumings for generations, were able to harmoniously establish the kind of in terms of managing their natural resources. So, this perhaps is something which needs to be debated. Now, again according to the National Forest Policy of 1988, which is issued by the government of India, one of the main reasons of the loss of forest cover in the hills is because of the spread of fire, which is pretty much a part of the techniques and methods in jhum cultivations, which not only affects regeneration of catchment, but also wildlife species. So, this sort of blaming, the blame game which is being branded upon these jhumias is something which again is being enshrined in the National Forest Policy. Now, under this policy, new strategies for development and rehabilitation of the tribal populations in altering the jhuming practices are being initiated. Now, again this kind of policy is being done in the name of preserving and restoring the environment stability, and jhum cultivation has been labeled as primitive practices. Now, what was evident from this is that this creation of this social landscape that is legible to the state authority implied the destruction of the informal non-state structure of trust and cooperation. Now, James C. Scott have come up with this notion because he in a way propound this idea of the civilization notion, and then how these communities are in a way considered to be evading the state or not wanting to come under the rule of the state, because they do not want to conform in terms of generating the revenue. Now, McDonough, who have done an extensive study in Northeast in the recent years, in his analysis of Northeast India again highlights that the mainstream Indian society has no hesitation in labeling the upland communities as primitive in the contemporary politics and development. Now, what are the advantages and disadvantages in the context of this environmental sustainability? Now, if you look at the studies made by Kunklin, Geertz and Spencer, and also Freeman, Werner and Ramakrishnan, and Kunklin perhaps is the first to have studied shifting cultivation in a much more detailed analysis by trying to look at the different kinds of data and the amount of food crops which are being planted, so on and so forth. So, perhaps the first credit of this cultivation, shifting cultivation goes to Kunklin, and others followed. Now, they suggest that Sweden cultivation as a system of land use does a minimal effect or damage to the environment and can be successfully used as a rational system in marginal areas. Now, as a result of the kind of the hill terrain or the steep areas, those communities who practices the Sweden cultivation have no choice, but they have to, because they do not have much of an access to the outside technology. Now, and in their detailed analysis and study, they come up with the conclusion that it has a minimal damage to the environment, and it can have it can be termed as a rational system. And perhaps maybe because of the diversity of species in the cropping system, and also ensures conservation of precious minerals in the soil and capture solar energy through a perennial plant cover. So, herein comes again this idea of the agroforestry. Now, the debate again is on how to situate shifting cultivation, which is not only an age-old agriculture practices, but also which is intrinsically related to the cultural and identity of those practicing it. Now, most ethnic minorities which are regarded it as a system in which the quantities of agriculture products grown depend on the needs of the cultivators, that is maybe the family, the community, so on and so forth. For example, land that is communally owned is also communally cultivated, and the local organization is responsible for the distribution of the harvested agriculture products. So, herein comes the question of that idea of communitarianism and egalitarianism, because the idea of hierarchy, class division, or maybe the idea of surplus does not arise. Now, such an approach which does not aim to make profit from the agriculture surplus tends to judiciously use natural resources and forests. So, in a way they tends to rely on the forest for their own basic needs, and they have that guided by the ecological philosophy of causing a minimal harm to the resources, because they tends to generate only their basic needs. Now, the local practices to do with ecosystem and resource management gave this indigenous group the experience to deal with uncertainty and unpredictability intrinsic to old ecosystem. So, therefore, this idea of environmental determinism or the environmental possibilism both in a way tends to play among these or in these local practices. Now, however, the emphasis on these modern methods of cultivation, that is which is being pushed forward by the government policy makers, have not only led to labeling the shifting cultivation as primitive use by the indigenous people, but also disregarding this traditional knowledge system and their capacity of improving the existing methods. These are something which also we have come across while discussing the indigenous knowledge and traditional ecological knowledge. So, I am just merely trying to link up with those concepts. And if you look at most government policies tend to question the feasibility of shifting cultivation and urge many of those communities to undertake the terrace cultivation. Now, the idea or differences between the terrace cultivation, which is much more stable and permanent, has to be in a way being an option or optional to those jhumias. Now, the question is, can jhum cultivation be an effective and self-sufficient method that does not damage the environment? Perhaps this question has led scholars and policy makers to propose alternatives such as terrace and settle cultivation. And one of the policy behind terrace cultivation is that it increases water retention and ability through terracing results in a higher agriculture output that obtained than that obtained in the shifting cultivation, because shifting cultivation is seen to be much more labor extensive and the output is low. So, that sort of comparison between the two has made a conclusion or propagated by the state policy makers to opt for terrace cultivation. Now, the issues of these land and property relations and land use under this shifting cultivation is communally owned, but land under terrace cultivation can be used as a commodity because it can be owned individually. Now, therefore, one needs to look at the idea of this ownership, because once this terrace cultivations comes into practice or being adopted, the idea of this commodity that is which can be sold and pledged. So, this idea of individualism emerges, and the idea of this communitarian or egalitarian in a way will be will become redundant. Now, the concept of jhumia, if you look at the historical account which is given by Scott, this jhumia is a term which is coined by William Van Sandelt, and what he talks about is that why most ethnic communities in the hill regions of Thailand, Cambodia, India and China are in a way engaging in this sort of evading the state. He argues that an estimate of roughly about 100 million people who live in this region have fled into the hills to avoid taxation, that is the revenue which is still much come into practice right from the colonial period, and also they want to avoid the slavery, indentured labor, war and other negative corollaries of this state, including famines and epidemics. They remain the world's largest refugee population that lies in the shadow of the state, which doesn't come under the purview of the state governance. Now, the measures to contain this jhum cultivation in a way have created economic uncertainties for these ethnic minorities, and settle cultivation has forced them to assimilate into the national economy or the state economy, which in a way can be levied certain kind of revenues. Now, there are also scholars who criticize the concept of this state-led development as a tool for civilizing the margins. Now, this group of scholars or school of thought has argued that the development policies are aimed at those sections of society that are regarded as uncivilized, backward, primitive, savages, and by those initiating the path of development by comparative analysis among various groups and parameters such as the physical appearance, industrialization, agriculture techniques and settlement patterns. Now, what are the kind of policy which is being witnessed against jhum cultivation? The government has time and again initiated that terrace cultivation in the jhum control program in a way has failed to provide adequate income to the jhumias. This is also partly seen in the context of the Riangs in the Tripura state, and partly because the state initiative has failed, that it has in a way resulted in the widening gap between the rich and the poor, because the part as in terrace cultivation, it is individually owned and it is sort of private property which can be in a way sold. So, the one who has a much more upper hand in terms of cash or power has and unlimited way of expansion of their agricultural land, and so is the accumulation of wealth, because it relies on surplus. Now, unlike the settled or this terrace cultivation, jhum cultivation again is pretty much diversified and produce mixed crops, and which we talk about the self-sustenance. Now, settled cultivation again is seen as an alternative to this jhum cultivation, does not seem to have to be very efficient. It has in a way disrupted the egalitarian tribal society of jhumias, and it has no clear advantage, because it requires a large capital investment, because you have to rely on external agencies like the technology, maybe tractors and fertilizers, so and so forth. So it is sort of a huge investment for those who are switching over to the settled agriculture. And the basic reason why jhum cultivation has been rejected by the policymaker is the declining land-man ratio and reduction in the jhum follow cycle. And one of the differences between this terrace and jhum cultivation is that while one engages, the former engages in the commercialized agriculture and the latter centers on self-sustenance or self-consumption to have an adequate supply for the basic needs. Now, the human labor and seeds are the only two investment in jhum cultivation, and it is apt that the jhumias grows crops for self-consumption. Now, apart from the human labor and seeds, there is no other investment which is required, but on the contrary, in settled cultivation it requires a capital and non-capital investment. Such investment options may not be available to the jhumias, which in a way compel them to borrow money from the organized and unorganized sectors, or work as laborers or in farms. This reduces their self-sufficiency, but also pose an economic burden to them, because they have to borrow money, and how the local money lenders operate and how they operationalize, because the local farmers tend to accumulate or borrowed money, and with the interest it goes on. So, eventually when the time for this harvesting come, they have to bear the brunt of those, the interest and the capitals. So, there is nothing really left at the end, because all the products are being sold off to pay off their debt. So, they become sort of a debtor. Now, jhuming is in a way considered to be a misconception, because jhuming cultivation forms an integral part of the tribal lifestyle. It is not just a means of livelihood, but also the entire socio-cultural religious activities are interwoven into the different stages of cultivation or the agriculture cycle. It may be therefore unwise to evaluate Sweden cultivation in merely a pure economic terms, as this narrow approach fails to capture the full significance of its merits, and most of the government policy initiatives are based on the economic evaluation of Sweden culture, have in a way been geared towards discouraging its practices. Now, opposition shifting cultivation is merely based on this kind of misconception. Now, you can perhaps look at the feasibility of shifting cultivation. What are the kind of the different disciplines have different ideas and opinions regarding this, and scholars have opposing ideas and their own perspective. So, the best way to look at jhuming in a words much more the feasibility is to also take into account the socio-culture background of those who are practicing. It should not be merely based on the idea of the economic perspective, but different sorts of needs to be taken care of. Now, maybe this is the present scenario of how this traditional form practices is seen to be unsustainable by the policy makers and different practitioners. Now, maybe if you look at some of these references, you can have much more wider understanding of how shifting cultivation, the kind of debate which emerges and the controversies, and perhaps one way of looking at it is trying to trace the historical background of how the policies are being framed, and the advantages and disadvantages and the debates of how shifting cultivation can be contextualized and situated by taking into account the socio-cultural background of those communities practicing it. Thank you.